Ready to rock?
Yeah, let's just do it.
Yes.
Boom. Good luck. Good luck. So you can hide me, Valeria. Just remove me from the stream. Good luck.
But welcome, Alan. Thank you for adjusting, and the stage is yours. Please share your thoughts and wisdom about how to achieve effective software development.
Thank you. So first of all, we've been having technical issues. So I had all these great slides prepared and you can't see them. So the slides were just kind of boring slides with text on them. So it's not that big a deal. But you won't be able to see my email address and that kind of stuff, which is how I like to field questions and stuff afterwards. So let me just say it, and then I can move on. My main address is my name. It's alan@holub.com, HOLUB.com. And on Twitter, I'm Alan Holub, and on Mastodon, I am Alan Holub at mstdn.social. So hopefully that didn't go by so fast that you didn't see them, but there we are. It's a there's always technical difficulties, and this is proof. So what I want to talk about this morning for me, or whatever time it is, wherever you are, is a set of heuristics that I put on my website, probably 6-8 months ago now, about effective ways to do software development. Now, I am deliberately ignoring the word agile when I say this, because agile has turned into this perverted morass of horrible stuff that doesn't work. And as Andy Hunt once said, agile has become do half of Scrum badly and use Jira. And of course, none of those things have to do with agile. So I'm kind of giving up on the word. It brings too many kind of bad connotations with it. So what I did is I then, in my own history, said, okay, let's go back and look at the Agile Manifesto, but I'm finding that people don't understand the Agile Manifesto either. It's too brief. And a lot of people deliberately interpret it in negative ways in order to discredit Agile. And so it's not working anymore either, unfortunately. It's a great document. I recommend that you pay attention to it, but it's just not working out anymore. So I came up with these heuristics. They're on, if you want to look at them, they're on holub.com/HEU. But so I'm going to go through them. We're not going to be able to do all of them in an hour or 50 minutes. So I've changed the order around a little bit to put what I think as the most critical things first. And then we can go through as many as we can go through. So let's start. The first thing on that web page is not actually a heuristic. It's a copy of a tweet that I gave a long time ago that is summarizing Agile in 3 sentences. Work small, talk to each other, and make people's lives better. And that's really the core of doing things in effective ways. Is that by working small, what I mean is that you develop very, very, very small bits at a time. Now, I work from user stories. The word user story is another term that's gotten perverted into something that has no relationship to what it originally was. A user story, really, the actual definition is a user story is telling the user's story. In other words, it's not a code word for some task that you have to do. The user story describes your user's work, not yours. So it's describing a user's problem. And it does that as a couple sentences at first, and you flesh it out right before you develop. But the point is that you don't know what the solution is going to be until you actually start developing the software. So part of that process is to make these stories as small as possible. You want to reduce scope. One of the good ways to describe that is with something called workflow analysis. And with workflow analysis, what you do is map out the whole workflow through the whole story, and then pick one path through that work story, and that's a smaller story. The other way you could look at it is that if there are if statements in the work story, every branch is a separate story. If there's a switch statement. Every case is a separate story. So you make the stories as small as possible. And once you do that, you then start implementing. Now, talk to each other is the next stage there. So what that means is you're having continuous conversations with the other developers, with people in the company, the business people, and of course, with the users. And that's something that a lot of people leave out, and something that a lot of fake agile companies don't allow you to do. It's impossible. But since you don't have a solution when you start working, you have to develop that solution collaboratively as you're working. In the planning stage, if you're doing sprint and sprint planning, you come up with enough details that you can start, not finish. And then you implement that, and then you get some feedback from your users, and then you change it and add more details and so forth until you eventually get done. So it's a continuous conversation. You're talking to everybody all the time. The last piece then is to make people's lives better, and that's what the story is all about. That's what we're working for. Sprint has this notion of a sprint goal, and a lot of people misinterpret it, or Scrum rather has a notion of a sprint goal, and a lot of people interpret that as finish these 5 stories, and that's not it at all. Is that if you actually read the Scrum Guide, which I recommend that you do, a sprint goal is a strategic goal. Basically, it's make the user's life better in this area, in this subject area, in this part of the system. And again, it doesn't describe the system. It describes your users' problems and how to make things better for them. So the entire focus then of this approach is on users, not on tech. Is that the user stories describe the user's work. They're small. You continuously talk to them. You talk to each other too, of course. You talk to people on your team. You talk to other teams. You do whatever talking you need to make the work work. And then you are doing it in order to make everybody's lives better. And that's not just the customer, that's also you. So if you can't go to work every day, rested and relaxed and with a smile on your face and able to do the best work, something is wrong there. If your process doesn't allow you to be happy, if you're not smiling, there's something really wrong with what you're doing. So don't do that, right? Just think about yourself. So next issue, moving into the heuristics itself, the first one says without psychological safety, respect, and trust, you can't do anything. So let's talk about those 3 issues. Again, core things that have to happen in order to be an effective software developer. Psychological safety was developed by a woman named Amy Edmondson, who's written a few great books. One's called Teaming, and one is, what's the second one called? I've spaced out. I'll tell it to you when I come in, but her name is Edmondson, Edmundson, I believe, or En. But Amy was working in hospitals, and the problem that she uncovered was that a lot of good advice was being ignored because of the power structure within the hospital. And nurses, for example, were really unwilling to speak up during meetings where they were talking about improving process. And we all see that, right? It's people not really willing to speak up because of the power structures within the organization. So what psychological safety is that it's not safety in the current sort of woo-woo sense, right? It doesn't mean you go into a room with people that have to follow certain rules in order to be able to interact, and that one of those rules is almost always don't have real discussions, right? Don't get so upset about something that you raise your voice, right? All of that stuff. Psychological safety has nothing to do with that. Psychological safety is an environment in which you can speak without fear, no matter what you have to say. So if you need to criticize the process, maybe even if you need to criticize people, that of course that's got to be done carefully just from a social point of view. But nobody should ever feel that they can't say something. So psychological safety is not, in other words, about eliminating discussion. It's about improving discussion, about increasing the level of discussion that happens, making the discussion more lively, and getting work done. So there are some side effects to that. Is that one of the things that you see in the quote safety movement is people say you should never interrupt anybody. And that's not strictly true. Is that if you're going to have a lively discussion, there's going to be a certain amount of what Tim Oettinger calls collaborative overlap in talking, right? So people have to be very much aware that that's going to happen if people are excited, and that's fine. And everybody can do it. So if somebody is feeling that they can't get a word in edgewise, then they should speak up in a safe environment. And people should then pay attention in a safe environment and deal with it. So that's the first thing, psychological safety. Respect is the next one, is that if you respect the people that you work with, then a safe environment becomes much easier. It's the way I think about this is give people the benefit of the doubt. So if somebody's stepping on the ends of your sentences all the time and they're doing it because they're excited rather than because they're doing some kind of power thing and they're wanting to discount you, then where respect goes is in the direction of giving them the benefit of the doubt. Respect also has huge effects on management. In an effective system, the people in management respect the people that are doing the work. There's an important lean principle that I think applies to all of this, which is that the person that's doing the work makes the decisions. So that's a misunderstood concept, unfortunately, and it should be, it's essential. So you don't have a situation where data flows up to some manager and then decisions flow back down, because by the time you've made that loop, the decision is not valid anymore. Things on the ground have changed. And more to the point, if you're going up through multiple layers, you're playing a game of telephone, or what they call Chinese whispers in the UK, where you have a bunch of kids in a circle and each of them whispers a message to the kids that are around them. And then when it gets all the way around the circle, it's been distorted into something awful. The problem with that is that people have studied this game, and what they find is that the kids deliberately change the message a little bit in order to make it funnier. So, that's a benign thing to do. But what happens when you do that up the hierarchy, down the hierarchy thing is that every stage you go through, people start changing it for political reasons. And they start changing it because they don't understand something. So they change it into something that they think is better, but it's actually wrong. So that just doesn't work. That system does not work. And all of the things that surround it, the surveillance that happens inside of JIRA, constantly collecting ridiculous metrics that have no real impact on anything, but they're used to punish people. None of that is good. So the solution to that, where respect gets us, is that you respect that the people who are doing the work can actually make the decisions. So if a team is talking to a customer and they need to change something, they just change it. They don't ask for permission from anybody. They don't go to some product owner and ask permission there. The product managers ideally would be working with the teams on a day-to-day basis. So the product manager would be right there in the room when the decision is being made, and they could supply their input. But I don't believe in the Scrum product owner notion, is that it's too much a single point of failure. And from my point of view, these things all should be done collaboratively, like by the team, which means that everybody, again, has to respect everybody and trust everybody. So that's the third thing. Trust is you have to trust the people who are doing the work to make decent decisions. You've got to trust the people around you to contribute. Everything is based on those three principles. So moving on. The next principle is that everything that we do is part of a system, part of a larger system. And if you focus on local optimization, that typically does not improve the behavior of the system at all. There's a lot wrong with bad software development that has to do with looking at individual people, individual performance reviews, for example, or looking at the effectiveness of a team. And that kind of focus hardly ever helps. Is that the only time The individual never matters. What matters is the team. And it's, of course, in a trusting environment, the team will help the people that are slowing them down in order to make them not slow them down. So there's a mentoring relationship. There's training going on. If there's a trust relationship, if a team needs training, they just go get it. They don't ask anybody. They don't get permission. They just go get it. And the team itself then is responsible for improving itself. Now, whether an individual team will have an impact on the whole system depends entirely on whether they're what's called a bottleneck or not. So if a lot of people depend on one team and that one team becomes the bottleneck, that all work has to flow through that one team before it can distribute back out again, then optimizing that team will help. It's better, though, if you distribute the load that that team is shouldering by not having a single bottleneck, by having multiple teams. And the best situation is to not have teams dependent on each other at all. So the notion of a database team and a UX, UI team and a development team and a product team, those kind of silos are working against you. So if you're trying to do things in an effective way, it's essential that all the teams be able to do all the work. They call this cross-functional in the Agile world. So the notion is that a team should be able to take an idea and get it into the customer's hands. And in order to make that effective, you need things like DevOps, but DevOps is not operations. It's developers using automated tooling to do things like deployment so that it won't take a lot of time, right? Because they're responsible for getting it into the customer's hands, not delivering it to some ops organization that will deploy it in a month or 2 months. They're responsible for getting it into the customer's hands. And the reason they're doing that is they need feedback. So there's another point that I'll come to in a moment, but the idea of feedback is essential to all of this. If you're working very small, the reason you're working very small is so you can get what you're working on into people's hands, so you can get feedback, so you can improve it. Now, that doesn't mean you have to get it in everybody's hands, right? If you're doing a release, you don't have to release to 100,000 people. You could release to 10 and get their feedback and adjust. And then when they're happy, you can then release it to 100 and get their feedback and adjust. And if they're happy, you can release it to a few thousand and just roll it out in stages like that. But the point of working small is that you get feedback faster. And you can't get feedback faster if there's that hierarchy of permissions. And you can't get feedback faster if you're working too big. And you can't get feedback faster if some ops department is sitting on what you did and refusing to actually release it to people. So at the center of all this notion is we have a whole system that is important. And in most situations, though, the teams are not dependent on each other. So the speed at which a team works kind of doesn't matter, because nobody's depending on them finishing before they can do what they're doing. If you read about user stories, the basic idea of a user story is that let's see, let me think about how to say this in a moment. There's a set of criteria that Bill Wake came up with called the INVEST criteria. And the I in INVEST stands for independent. And what he means by that is that it shouldn't matter what order the stories are implemented in. If there's a dependency between two stories, it's probably not two stories. It's probably one larger story. It's possible to make that larger story smaller, but the story has to cover everything end to end. It has to cover everything from the start of the work to the user getting into a state where they're happy. They've delivered something that they've built something that is an important outcome in the domain. So if your stories are not independent, you can't work in the way I was just describing, where a whole single team gets a story and works at whatever pace makes sense for them for that particular story. So speed is not an issue. There's a myth about Agile that it's about building things faster, and that's just complete nonsense. The construction part of an Agile team is typically not a whole lot faster than any other kind of construction. There are things that Agile teams do, like ensemble or mob programming, that do speed you up. Is that when you're working together as an ensemble where you've got, say, 6 brains all working on the same problem at once, you're going to move faster. So generally speaking, ensemble programming is going to speed the team up a bit. The more important things that ensemble programming do is that it increases quality without diminishing speed. And it increases the quality in every sense, right? The user experience will be better. The implementation will be better. You'll have no bugs, right? Because the code is being reviewed as you're working, which means that you don't have to do code reviews, and that speeds you up. So there are things that Agile, in the lowercase sense of the word, teams do that will make them go a little bit faster, but we're talking 10%, 20%, not 100% or 1,000% like the Scrum stands would have you believe. So why is Agile faster? Agile is faster because you don't waste time building things that nobody wants or needs. If you define the work as a big chunk, hidden inside that chunk is going to be a bunch of little chunks that are irrelevant, that nobody cares about. And if you are then tasking yourself with building the big chunk as a big chunk, you're going to be wasting a huge amount of time building the things that nobody cares about because you're not getting feedback fast enough. So that's, again, another systemic issue, right? Is the teams have to be independent or you can't work as a full system. But the other part of working in a system, which is equally important, is that the entire organization forms a single system. What I'm talking about is not something that you can just do in engineering or just do on the team. The whole organization has to do it because the organization has to support the things that you're doing as a team. And the organization has to support the things that you're doing as an entire engineering department or as an individual. And if that support is not happening, or if, as is often the case, the organization is fighting against you, it's preventing you from being flexible and doing your best work, then you're not going to get anything done. So the idea of Agile is something we do in the engineering department. That's nonsensical. Because if you have a overriding culture based on mistrust, and almost all big corporations, their culture is based on mistrust. If you have to get permission to do something necessary, then you are not being trusted. Nobody trusts you. If you are not trusted to get a pencil out of the supply cabinet, you're not trusted. And it's kind of an odd collision here, right? Because the basic notion of, let's put it this way, they trust you to build software that will kill the company if you don't do a good job. And that's pretty substantial. So if they're trusting you to not kill the company, why don't they trust you to know that you need a class in some subjects and just take it? Right? Is why force you to go up through this chain of command to get 2 or 3 or 4 permissions to take a class. Leaving aside the fact that that whole process of getting permission might cost more than the class does, in a trusting organization, you don't have that problem. But again, we're talking about the system here, is that if the surrounding system requires that kind of nonsense, then the subsystem of engineering won't be able to do its work effectively. Is that everything counts and everything has to work together as a single system. And as soon as you start not doing that, you can't work again. So the other kind of principle here is that since everything is a connected system, you can't change anything without tweaking everything. If engineering starts doing things in a slightly different way, you have to make sure that they're getting supported by the larger organization. So a lot of the fake Agile systems like SAFe, right? SAFe is kind of an abomination. I don't know anybody who actually really understands Agile ways of working that thinks anything good about SAFe. There's nothing good there. Big corporations like it though, because they can keep existing bureaucratic management systems in place and existing control hierarchies in place and call themselves Agile. And that's not the way it works, because you have a big system. Is that if you're going to work in an Agile way, that control hierarchy has got to go, because you're moving decisions down to the people who are doing the work. So you're not controlling anymore. The hierarchy will be much flatter, because the teams are working at the best pace they can to implement the story that's in place. But this whole notion of being on schedule is not really relevant. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have deadlines, of course. Is that if you have a deadline, scope has to change. So if you have to get this out by Christmas, or if you have to get this out by tax time, then you start off by saying, okay, what do we really need to do to satisfy that? If it was a tax problem, you say, well, by tax time, it must be possible for people to, or to collect, let's put it the other way. It must be possible to collect the information that you need to file your taxes, and it must be possible to file them. So that's the key thing. To get that done, all of the bells and whistles, fancy UIs and that kind of stuff, you can do that later. So the idea of working in an agile way is that you work in very small chunks, and the first chunks you work on are the most important, the most valuable. And then if there's still time left to the deadline, then you can fill that in, making it better. So doing the critical stuff first is an important part of this, but it also has to do with this notion of if you change something little, you've got to change everything to provide the support. So you can't improve an overall system just by tinkering with the parts. So if you think of a car as a system, the point of which is to transport you from point A to point B. Car has a lot of subsystems in it. It's got engines, it's got wheels, it's got transmissions. So let's say you need to get from point A to point B faster. So you say, okay, we'll put a bigger engine in it. Horsepower will solve all problems. But if you put a bigger engine in, now you've got to change the engine mounts. You've got to change the strength of the drivetrain. You've got to change the suspension to handle the weight. You've got to change the brakes, right? Because if you're moving faster, you've got to still brake effectively. And by the time you're done, when you drop that better engine in, you will have changed pretty much everything in the entire system in order to accommodate the new variable. And work developing software follows exactly those same rules. The final thing I'll say about this before I move on to another point is that a 10x programmer, right, the hero that comes in and saves the day, has exactly the same problem as that engine. Is that if you drop one of those people into the organization, but you don't change everything to make it work, then it won't work. There's no benefit. By the same token, that one hero, right, the 10x programmer rapidly becomes a bottleneck. We talked about bottlenecks a moment ago. So what that means is that if you have one person who's the expert, what happens is that people tend to then funnel most of their work through the expert, and then they sit around playing canasta or something until the expert finishes, which slows the entire system. They become a bottleneck. So that gets us back to notions of trust, and that gets us back to notions of talking to each other and of cooperation, of collaboration, is that the most valuable use of that expert programmer is for that person to teach everybody else how to get as good as they are. That's by far the most valuable thing for them to do. Not doing the work itself, as that's not particularly useful because of all the things we were just talking about. Is that the important thing is that they help the entire system move faster. So everything is systemic. If you want to follow up on this, I have a reading list on my website. It's holub.com/reading. And there's a section up towards the top of that reading list that has a bunch of references, books, and so forth on systems thinking. So it's worth reading those. Peter Senge's book is probably the place to start. It's the most accessible of it. There's a lot of systems thinking books are pretty turgid, so you might not want to start with the actual systems thinking books. I'm sorry, I'm looking over here. I have to look at the version of the slides that works on my machine in order to know what to talk about next. The next issue is that processes exist in order for people to be able to be effective and happy. So if the process dominates, then it's impossible to do any of the things I was just talking about. There is zero value in getting better at Scrum, because what you're doing there is elevating the process over the people. There's a lot of value in getting better at delivering value to your customers. Whether Scrum is the best way to do that or not is, we can argue about that, but a lot of people do some variant of Scrum. Mostly they're not actually doing Scrum. They're doing some weird thing that they've invented. But if you're doing Scrum properly, and by properly, what I mean here is kind of you're in agreement with the people who are actually experts, largely the Scrum training community. And I would argue even further that the Scrum.org people, Ken Schwaber's company, understands the issues much better than the Scrum Inc. and the Scrum Alliance people who are on Jeff Sutherland's side of the equation, because the Scrum.org people focus on agility and they focus on doing things in the spirit of the Scrum Guide rather than chapter and verse, do it by the letter. But putting that aside, the point is that if the focus is on doing Scrum better rather than focusing on the people who are doing the work and the customers, then you're going to fail. It's not about process. One of the big problems with things like SAFe is that it's this huge, complicated, bureaucratic process that people spend millions putting in place, and they're not thinking at people. You look at that horrific diagram that's on the SAFe website that shows all of the block diagram of what SAFe is, and I challenge you to find people on that diagram. That diagram is almost entirely about process and management, which is part of the process. And there's no, the customer is this tiny little thing in one corner, and it isn't even present on some of those diagrams. And the people doing the work are a tiny little statement in another corner, and they're not even given names, right? They're just sort of, it says workers or something in that diagram. But the people are more important. Those two things, the people who are doing the work and the people that you are selling to, are more important than any kind of process. And if whatever process you have is not elevating the needs of those people, dump it. It's not doing anything useful. You know, and people complain about, well, the process requires that we enter a ticket, right? An item comes in that's going to take 5 minutes to fix. And instead of just fixing it, you have to put a ticket in Jira and then sort it into the backlog, and that, you know, get it done in a certain amount of time, and yada, yada, yada. That's putting process over people. The people in question here are your users. And if there's a problem that takes 5 minutes to fix, just fix it. Don't let process dominate the work. So that's the next equation here, is that processes are not important, is that a good, agile in the lowercase sense organization will not be following a process. If everybody in your company is doing exactly the same thing, if every team in your company is doing Scrum, you're not paying attention to this principle, because the teams themselves get to decide how they're going to work. And if the team says this isn't working for us, they get to work in some other way. If they want to do Scrum, fine. But if they don't, that's equally fine. And if they want to modify Scrum into something that works for them but doesn't adhere to the Scrum Guide, that's fine, provided that you keep all of these other principles in mind. So the people have to come first in this world. Next thing. The best ways to work are collaborative. I talked about ensemble programming a moment ago, and that's one example of that. So collaboration infuses everything. You are collaborating with your customers to come up with the best solution for them, which is to say you're delivering frequently so that they can see something concrete. And then you sit down and collaborate. You have a discussion about what's right and what's wrong and what's best to improve it. You spend time learning how the customers work. As I did a job for an investment bank decades ago now, but the first thing that I did as part of that job is that I spent 2 weeks going through the new hire training program for the stockbrokers, just so I could really understand how their work worked. And so I could have a conversation with them. I could speak the same language. I knew what was important to them and what was not important to them, and so on and so forth. And that made me much more effective at developing software for those people to use. So when you're working collaboratively, you have to first learn about the people that you're working with so that you can communicate effectively. And then you make decisions together. So people talk about customer-driven design. That doesn't mean that the customer tells you what to do. What that means is that the needs of the customer are driving things. And in order to understand those needs, you have to be able to have a conversation with them. So collaboration is at the center of that. But collaboration also has a lot of issues in other places, is that you don't, somewhere in the Scrum Guide, it says you negotiate with the PO. if you need to make changes within the Scrum, and negotiation is not collaboration. So whenever you see that word negotiate, that means that a collaborative relationship doesn't exist. And the goal is to not necessarily agree. The goal is to come to not consensus, but consent. And what consent is people saying, well, I don't honestly know if this is going to work. I personally think this thing is better, but I'm being overruled here, or we just can't tell. We don't know. So if you really have two options and you neither but can prove that the other one is better than the other, which is usually the case, just flip a coin. Doesn't matter, right? It's a collaborative process. So you flip a coin and you build one, and if it doesn't work, you throw it out and build something else, right? That's the agility in this system. So that's part of collaboration, though, right? Is that if you're collaborating with somebody and nobody knows, you don't argue, you don't negotiate, you run an experiment and find out. It's part of the collaborative process. So you don't collaborate, you don't negotiate with management, you don't negotiate with product people, you don't negotiate salaries. Salaries are determined collaboratively in an organization like this. Everybody is paid fairly, everybody is paid well. All the salaries for the whole organization are transparent, which gives the management a little bit of motivation to pay women the same as men, for example, or just even things out collaboratively. I know of one case where you had a typical organization where everybody's salaries were secret. And there was a big bonus at the end of the year. And the manager, this was Ryan Ripley, who is a great Scrum coach if you want to learn Scrum. But what Ryan did is he got everybody in a room with a whiteboard, and he said, here's the total amount of bonus that I've been given to distribute. And I'm not going to distribute it, you are. So he wrote the number up on the board and left the room. And at that point, the team looked at that, and first thing they asked is, what's your salary? Everybody put their salary up, and then they distributed the bonus in such a way that it compensated for the people who were getting paid too little to bring their salary up to level. And the people that were at the top didn't take any bonus at all. So everything leveled out, and basically they were making the same amount of money every year. That's collaboration. And when you have negotiation in salaries, you don't have that. You get a lot of imbalance in the teams, and that imbalance impacts the work, right? Bonuses impact the work in a negative way, is that they pit people against each other. It's people they withhold information, they hoard knowledge, because that gives them an edge that makes them better than the rest of the team, so they get a higher bonus. You don't want that. It's not effective. So collaboration is important throughout this process. Collaboration with the customers, collaboration with each other, collaboration with the business, but not negotiating. Negotiating does not help at all. The next point is that, well, actually, it's one that I made earlier, so I don't know that this is the issue with not having the slides in front of me as I'm talking. I kind of go off and talk about things for the next slides. But again, we're talking, well, I won't even talk about this one. This one was about feedback and short cycles, and I think we've discussed that enough. Next order of business. The most effective organizations are learning organizations. Learning is the work. Learning is not something that you do in order to do the work. Learning is the work itself. So when we release small and collaborate with our customers to find out what's wrong and what's right, and then improve things, we're learning. The way to think about this is that everything we do, from releasing a story to learning the stuff that we need in order to build the story, that's all learning. Everything's learning. When we release a story, that's an experiment. And the point of an experiment is to learn something. So we release a story and get feedback in order to learn whether that story was the right approach or not. You cannot fail in a release. It's not possible to fail, because you always succeed in learning something, and it is our goal to learn things. Of course, if you're a learning organization, there's also traditional learning to think about, and that's incorporated into the organization itself. The last time I was a principal architect somewhere, I set up a regular biweekly university where people came and learned something. This was not a lunch and learn. I do not believe that you should take away people's lunchtime in order to have them work. That's just 19th century thinking, right? Is force people to work every minute of the day. It's not good. It doesn't work well. So the basic idea then is that if what you're doing is learning all the time, then learning is part of your normal day. It's just something you do. Hunter Industries, which is one of the better, more agile shops that I know about. Hunter is the place where Woody Zuhl worked, and his team invented mob / ensemble programming at Hunter, and they are doing mobbing 100% of the time. In this case, they're doing 100% remotely too, which is a good thing. This mobbing, it works remotely just fine. But the point here is that every day they have a learning hour. They start the day with a learning hour, and this is not extra activity. This is the first hour of the normal workday. And basically, somebody on the team teaches the rest of the team something useful. And that might be associated with the work, it might not be. It might be a discussion of architecture, just, something that just learning more about the profession. That's a perfectly legitimate topic there. So they spend an hour every morning learning. Some organizations take it even further than that. They'll take an entire day out of the week and spend that on personal projects, which can be anything, right? The point of it is that by building these personal projects, you learn stuff, and that's eventually going to help the company. And that's true. It works well. So learning is at the center of pretty much everything that we do. The final thing, since we're running out of time, is that the notion of welcoming change is also essential to working effectively. So if something needs to change, you just change it. And that rule applies not only to the work, not only to the stories that you're working on, but it also applies to the organization itself and the processes that you do and the products that you make. A lot of people talk about roadmaps, a tactical roadmap that says, we have plotted out the work that we're going to do for the next 3 months, right? Tactics. We're going to build this, then we're going to build that, then we're going to build this other thing. There is no scope for change in that. It's a completely failed business strategy. Instead, what you want to do is, again, focus on change. So a roadmap in an effective organization is entirely strategic. We need to move into this business area. This part of the system is making our customers unhappy, and we have to make them happier in that region, in that area. It doesn't tell you exactly what you have to accomplish, as that's up to the teams. So the strategic direction says, we need to move into this business area that we're not in. And then it's the team's responsibility to figure out how. Right? I know people who are ex-military, and they say, well, if you're a squad in the field, they don't tell you how to get to a destination. They say, we need you to be over here, figure out how to get there. And that's exactly the way things are working in an effective organization, is that you are constantly, things are constantly changing. And if things are constantly changing, you can't do things that don't allow for change. Hold on for just 1 second. My dog just stole something. Bingley, leave it. Sorry, that's the one disadvantage of doing this at home, is that I have to deal with this menagerie that I have living with me. But the basic idea here, though, is the planning that you do, the process that you have, and the nature of the work, what you're building, all has to be able to change in order to accommodate learning, in order to accommodate learning. So learning and changing are really two sides of the same coin. And this applies, again, to everything, is that certainly applies to roadmaps, it applies to organizational structure, it applies to pretty much everything you're doing, is that welcoming change is essential. And you do that by learning things as you're working. So that's as many of the points we could get through. It's the most important ones. If you want to follow up on this, I don't want to do too much shameless self-promotion here, but I'm going to be doing a full day class on this subject that you could follow. In fact, the fraternity asked me to do that, but when they did, I didn't have the class together yet, so it wasn't really a possibility. But if you sign up for my mailing list, it's holub.com/subscribe. You'll get a note when I finally schedule the class. Right now, I'm thinking of scheduling one in February. And these points are essential. And the reason I titled this talk "Effective Software Development," rather than Agile, is because I want to people to start thinking about what's effective, not does it fit into some pigeonhole. So the basic, I'll finish, I guess, with that notion is that in order to be effective, you have to be developing your own ways of working based on a set of core principles. And the point of these heuristics is to establish what those core principles are so that you yourself can come up with the details of working in a way that's going to be effective overall. So we are at the end of our time here. And thank you all for attending, especially since I'm competing with Kent. Is that I really appreciate the fact that you're listening to me instead of Kent Beck, because Kent is definitely worth listening to as well.
Good. Thank you. And I have to share that everyone was so happy to see you without the slides and experience.
Oh, good. More and more I've been doing that. Is that not having slides seems to work better. It's kind of what's the point, but there we are.
Absolutely. And there was many notes like, this is so true. This is so true. And one of the things maybe what we can end off the day overall, of course, some people wonder, are there actually the companies that are making all this happen and following the principles, and like what to do if I'm a part of an organization that is preaching safe?
Yeah.
Like, can you encourage us and also give some advice of what to do when you are locked in?
Sure. I'm still live, right? Is that I'm talking to people?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Yes, there are companies that do all this. So you look at Hunter Industries, you look at much larger companies, right? Netflix, Salesforce, right? I'm just trying to think of these off the top of my head, so I'm not going to have a big list, but there are lots of companies in all sizes that do this. Now, I have to say that if your existing company is huge and not doing things well, changing the way they do things is really hard. It's much easier to do this with a small organization than with a large one. But there are some pretty big organizations that have done the flip, and some really huge organizations that are trying really hard to do this. Microsoft comes to mind immediately. So yes, it's possible. As for making the changes, absolutely that's possible. But I know from working as a consultant, which as a consultant, one of the things I do a lot is I come into a company and I kind of assess it. I just sort of walk around virtually and see how everybody's working. And then I'll sit down with the CEO and make suggestions about how to fix things. And there are a couple of issues there. One is that I determine what's keeping the CEO up at night, what their problems are. And then I don't say, we're going to transform to Agile. I think that's nonsensical. I say, well, here's a way to solve that problem. And of course, me being me, it's all going to be kind of lean, Agile ways of looking at things. But we focus on the actual business problems, which is something that the CEOs can understand. And I say, so you've got to provide this support. The teams have to change the way they work in this way in order to pull it off. It's an experiment. Let's not move this entire huge organization over there. Let's just take a couple of teams, have them do them for a month and see what happens. And all the stuff I was just talking about, in other words, and that can work, right? It's moving incrementally like that. The only downside I'll say about an incremental change like that is that if the increments are too long, if you change too slowly, the inertia of the larger organization is going to pull you back into the older way of working. So incremental changes can work very effectively in large organizations, provided that they're happening fast enough. If it takes more than a year or two to do an entire transition, you're moving too slowly. And I've seen many companies that have spent 3 or 4 years doing a quote Agile transition, and I have watched them systematically replace better ways of doing things with worse ways of doing things, because that's what they used to do. So the C-levels have to be involved, and you have to do it fast enough, and you have to focus on solving problems, not on installing some process.
Yeah,
the process kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah, when installing described process is so much easier. but yeah.
Well, it's mindless.
Yes.
I don't know that it's easy, right? Installing Safe is not easy. It costs a fortune. It costs millions of dollars. And but it's mindless. You don't have to think about it. Somebody else is telling you what to do.
Yes,
and as long as you like read through this giant tome and do everything on these 1,000 pages of directions, you will somehow be successful. And most you wouldn't get this from looking at the Safe website, but as far as I can tell, at least half, probably more of the organizations that move to Safe have abandoned it within a couple of years because it doesn't work.
Yeah, I have same experience.
And the problem there is that they then say this agile stuff doesn't work. They don't know that what they were doing was not agile, right? So there we are, right? So that makes it even harder to transition moving forward because they have in their brains this agile stuff doesn't work. So you can't use the word, the dreaded A word. Just don't use it. Just talk about being effective. Just do this better.
You describe so well all the pains and everything that is happening that I really wish like everyone who starts to work in our industry, they just watch you, read your book suggestion, and then start to organize.
Yeah, that reading list is pretty good, right? And it's just basic stuff. It's kind of a daunting list. There's probably 20 essential books on it.
Yes.
And then a lot of other books that fill in the gaps. But learning this stuff is not trivial. It's it's a curriculum, and you have to. It's a lot to learn.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Taking classes can be faster if you take classes from good people. That's often faster than doing the reading. Certainly, going to conferences like Devternity is a great way to kind of learn, right? And and again, that can be faster. You probably, if you're going that route, you probably need some coaching also because. If looking at Devternity, here we have this day that's packed with stuff and your brain gets full and you just forget things, right? And then there's all the sessions you couldn't go to because you were doing something else. I would have loved to have gone to Kent's session, but but I'm busy doing something else during this hour, so I couldn't. So having a coach around to keep you on track and sort of identify things that could use some improvement and then pointing you at resources that will help you improve. It's a good thing to have around when you're trying to do this.
Yes. Yeah, I will just in the end quote one of the person saying, "Your talk was amazing, Alan. Every minute was a pure gold." So big thank you, and I wish you a great holiday season and a very good start of the new year.
You too, rather. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.